Since the 1990s, way back in the 1990s, Reverend Charles Austin Joy has given the Gouldsboro Historical Society a large number of historical talks. We're trying to count how many. Since the 1990s, at least 26, maybe more. Taking us over 3 centuries of the town's founding, from the 18th century founding, which covers the Founders and Followers books, which we have for sale, and through the many builders of the region in the 19th century to some iconic episodes in the 20th century. Portraits of Maine's writers and Mary Ellen Chase and the artist Marsden Hartley. So almost all of these talks have featured a compassionate portrait of a key figure who provided a distinctive and lasting influence on the life of our region. And each person's portrait has been firmly set in his era and is showing us what was unique and distinctive about his times, and which also makes an important foundation for our own lifetime. In the process, Charles has set a very high standard of fascinating scholarship, giving us an enviable example for anyone who seeks to know the story of our past. So we are really incredibly lucky and fortunate to be witness to the historical contributions of our longtime speaker, Charles Joy.
This is the third of a trilogy that deals with really the development from the earliest days of the state of Maine. And I was originally asked to do something along this line for the 200th anniversary of Maine's statehood in 1820. And so it fell out that I would do 3. And so this is the third of the 3. Part 1, which was, 2 years ago, I called Sister Realm. There was a poem in Massachusetts about Longfellow, Pride of the Sister Realm, so long our own. So that was called Sister Realm, and that dealt with Maine from wilderness and settlement to statehood, and basically with Gouldsboro in mind, from 1763 to 1820. This was part of the Eastern Lands, as they called it in Massachusetts, and there was a struggling and hard-scrabble settlement. On the very edge of territory, only very recently French and Indian, and now British, ceded to Britain with Canada and India as trophies, following the French and Indian War. The settlers from 1763, the beginning, up through the Revolutionary War, barely scratched a living from the virgin forests on the frontier of Massachusetts, and very barely survived the American Revolution. The first economy of Gouldsboro was lumber. Part 2, I called That Piece of Time, and it ran from the settlement to village, running from 1820, when Maine became a state, to 1873, which was the death in Gouldsboro of Ephraim Wales Taft, the man I've studied for years and years and years, and who has been for me a real hero. I keep his picture on my desk in Virginia all the time. Taft was an exemplar of stable village life and society, as this town had emerged from the poverty and the paucity of its original settlement. As the first economy was lumber, the second economy was still lumber, but increasingly sea in terms of fishing and sailing. Part 3 tonight, I call From Village to Vacationland. The Gilded Age comes to Gouldsboro. and ushers in contemporary life. The Civil War ended, and a new era of peace and prosperity came to the United States. Ephraim Wales Taft, devoted to this town through many years, died in March 1873. In the same year that Mark Twain published a novel, which gives its title to the following period of time. There was still some lumber and the sea, but a brand new economy will be developing in this period, which will be Vacationland. So that today tourism is one of the major foundations of the economy of the state of Maine. Now, the first thing I want to do is a note about geography. We are considering the growth of modern Maine as vacation land. First thing you see when you come over the bridge from New Hampshire. We are tracking that development in the case study of Gouldsboro, which will be the progress from village to vacation land. The progress from the world of Ephraim Wales Taft in the 19th century, virtually to the foundation of the present time. And Gouldsboro's story is Maine's story in microcosm. And for our purpose here tonight, the separation of Winter Harbor from the old town had not yet happened. So the only way you can grasp the content of what we're thinking about tonight is to think of no town of Winter Harbor. It was one of the villages like West Gouldsboro, West Bay, Prospect, Birch Harbor, Winter Harbor, all on the same level within the old town of Gouldsboro that had been incorporated in 1789. People think, oh, it's two different towns. And so when we talk about Grindstone Point, oh, well, that's Winter Harbor. Yeah, but it wasn't when it was put together and the buildings were built. So that's the first thing you need to do, is erase any sense of two separate towns. It's one town, whose name is Gouldsboro. Winter Harbor was originally called Mosquito Harbor, and then it was called the District of Winter Harbor. And then finally, in the census of 1880, it was called the Port of Winter Harbor. And you can see its growth and its development, but all part of Gouldsboro until its separation as a separate town in 1895. Tonight, that separate reality between Winter Harbor and Gouldsboro is totally irrelevant. We are considering the peninsula, as Louise Dickinson Rich called it, we are considering the peninsula as a single entity, as it was until the separation. Now, what I would like to do is just quickly run through the sections of what we're going to be thinking about tonight so that you have some sense of how we progress as we go along. We're going to think about the Gilded Age, and then we're going to think about how the Gilded Age comes to Gouldsboro. And then third, we're going to think about the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, which was the agency of bringing the Gilded Age to this town. And then fourth, we're going to consider John Godfrey Moore, who is very underappreciated. I'm especially interested in him because he, like me, is descended from Henry Dyer and all those of Dyer's Bay. But he was the one, really, who was the impetus behind the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. So we'll think a little bit about him. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own family and the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. So that's kind of the scope of where we will be going tonight. The Gilded Age, and there are some books over here. Where are all the books?
That's the thing.
Oh, they're hiding behind that one.
Yeah.
Okay, there are 4 books over there. There are 4 novels. And one of them is The Gilded Age, which is the novel that gave rise to the title of the whole society in the whole period after the Civil War. It's a pivotal period in the United States where the cataclysm of the Civil War was over, and now a new country was really being forged with emphasis on the West. Now remember, gilded is an adjective from the word gilt. And gilt is really fake gold. You think about, oh, well, Victorian pictures have gilt frames, or they have golden frames. No, they don't. It's fake gold that's put on to look like gold on the picture frames. So we are talking then about the Gilded Age as opposed to the Golden Age. The years following the Civil War in the United States was a period of huge transition. The country had been torn apart and had been virtually reinvented. And the great preoccupation with slavery, which was a great concern of the whole country in the 19th century, was gone. The new day generated fresh and booming economic expansion. There became a lust for getting rich through land, which is the basic plot of the novel of The Gilded Age. Money became a major preoccupation of society, as in many ways it still is. All across the northern states, lots of new money and prosperity was generated in those years. As a result, it was a heavily materialistic time. There was much, much new money as opposed to old inherited family money. People with much new money wanted to be sure that it was noticed. They wanted to be sure that it was known that they had lots and lots of money. And much money bought leisure time and the ability to make money show. And so was developed Mount Desert Island. People largely from Philadelphia and New York had been introduced to this whole area in the coast of eastern Maine by artists like Thomas Cole, who painted idyllic scenes that were quite different to the cities where money was made in the pressured, tumbled, hurly-burly of city life in the United States. And so became Bar Harbor as the founding piece, and Mount Desert Island in a wider sense, the coming of the money to this area for leisure time. And Bar Harbor became known across the world as a desirable and prominent resort. There's a picture, one of the pictures here that you're welcome to look at afterwards if you want to ask me anything about them. But there's one picture of Bar Harbor in 1890, which is right on the threshold of the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. But it was time away for them. It was a vacation. Life here in the summertime was different from life as usual, with its pressures and demands of every kind in the major companies and institutions where they worked and made their fortune. And it was a major contrast to the traditional coastal lore of this area. The major transition from what it was as a village society to what it has become, Vacationland, began as a new and vital economic base in Maine. Money was hauled into this section of Maine. The same period saw the creation of a new town, Winter Harbor, out of the single unit of Gouldsboro. And third, the exposure of the village to a wider world, an emerging economic reality. Out of the Gilded Age in Maine, with much imported money, would emerge Vacationland, which would become, in time, a cornerstone of Maine's economy. Lumbering and fishing from the earliest settlement were extractive They extracted things from the earth, the sea, and the land. And they were very basic economies. Colin Woodard, the wonderful American historian, says that as late as 1850, quote, Maine was the poorest and most frontier-like New England state. In the period after the Civil War, there arose a new national prosperity even in Maine. There were advancing signs of progress to be seen. Railroads and steamships provided far easier and faster transportation. And for example, closer to Gouldsboro, the granite quarries were opening next door in Sullivan as new income-producing industry. As the native industries failed, the lumbering and the work of the sea, the rusticators and their economic prosperity, and then a wider tourism, became a significant and major part of the state economy of Maine. The settlers, who had been attracted to this area by desperation, wanted a place of toil to eke out a living. Rusticators, attracted by great natural beauty, sold by artists, wanted a place to play in their leisure. And so three authors frame this period. The beginning one, of course, as we've said, was Mark Twain, published in 1873, the same year that Taft died, and provided the name that came to be ascribed to this whole new post-war period. The title signifies much money, much flash, and little depth. The Gilded Age, the age of fake gold. Then next, we look at Sarah Orne Jewett, a Maine native born in South Berwick and lover of the state, who lived much of her adult life in Boston, and so in the summer became a, quote, summer person. South Berwick in summer, Boston in winter. She was the recorder of the memory of disappearing village life, such as Taft and others like him had known. She frames the period with her first, and finally with the most important of her books, Deephaven and the Country of the Pointed Firs. Deephaven was her first novel, published in 1877, 4 years after Taft died. The final chapter of her book, which is over there, was called Last Days in Deephaven. And she says, quote, "At last it was time to reestablish housekeeping and to take up the city life again. Village life was not stimulating. There would not be much to do in winter." And then the final chapter of her later and greatest of her books, The Country of the Pointed Firs, published in 1896, the year after the separation in Gouldsboro. Her final chapter is called The Backward View. And, quote, "At last it was time of late summer. The sunshine of a northern summer was coming to its lovely end." And she sails away from the little village of Dunnet Landing for Boston. And she says, "When I looked back again, the islands and the headland had run together, and Dunnet Landing and all its coasts were lost to sight." The perennial feeling of many of us who come in the summer and have to leave in the fall. And then a contemporary expression is this brand new book. Mount Desert Island came to give rise to what purported to be a simplified version of city life. Some were looking for just freedom. The contemporary book that's over there is by Alice Elliott Dark, and it's called Fellowship Point, published in 2022. And I was struck when I read this book that very possibly it's a euphemism modeled on Grindstone Point from the way the book is written. She says, "A spectacular and unique spot, blessedly far away from the social pressures and Episcopalian mumbo-jumbo of Newport and Bar Harbor. So that was the Gilded Age. It was divided between city and country. The village is morphing now into an advanced state, an advanced understanding of itself. So they're looking for a simplified version of what they had at home. Some were looking for a real Maine version, less highly charged than life at home in the high society of Philadelphia and New York. Facing Bar Harbor, 6 miles across the bay, was Gouldsboro Peninsula, clearly seen from Mount Desert Island and from the yachts sailing the waters of Frenchman's Bay. Visible to them were Grindstone Point and Schoodic Point, the fishing community of Winter Harbor in between. At that time, the communities of the town of Gouldsboro had been peopled by the descendants of the earliest settlers. Their preceding ancestors had settled in the previous century, not long before the Revolutionary War here, not for the natural beauty celebrated by the artists and the wealthy in Mount Desert Island, but here for subsistence survival. They were here because of desperate hope. They were not here for beautiful scenery. They came because of poverty, people down on their luck and desperate to make something of a living. On the other hand, the rusticators, the new settlers in Bar Harbor and Mount Desert Island, as opposed to the earlier natives and their descendants, were looking for more reward than all the money that had made this possible. Vacationland in Gouldsboro is closely connected to its mother ideal in Mount Desert Island. That's the reason the 1890 picture of Bar Harbor is there. From Fellowship Point, that new novel, she says, the wealthy man designed for civilization. He couldn't sustain simplicity. He and his friends were used to having friends who were used to having servants in their houses. They couldn't move their households from Philadelphia to Maine without help. Who would cook? Who would clean? It made more sense for everybody to bring their servants from Philadelphia. And such a society, appealing to such a section of society, was crafted by the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. So we think about the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. The contemporary advertising book is right there on that table, which is the best introduction to the organization and its work in a book which is contemporary. The Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, Winter Harbor, Maine, a description of its property upon Grindstone Neck and the Schoodic Peninsula in Frenchman's Bay near Bar Harbor, published in 1890. There were 5,000 acres in all, owned by the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, which itself was incorporated in 1889. The 2 points of land, Grindstone Point and Schoodic Point, protruded into the Gulf of Maine, and Winter Harbor, fishing village, was nestled between the two. And in 1889, this land of 5,000 acres was conveyed from Charles H. Hutchins to the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. So we think first about Grindstone Point, Grindstone Neck, as the description is in that book. The description said, quote, is one of the most valuable and unique pieces of property, not only in Frenchman's Bay, but on the New England coast. The population control was paramount in the advertisement. In view of the fact that, quote, Winter Harbor now resembles Bar Harbor, as it was before it became ultra-fashionable, and possesses every advantage peculiar to resorts upon Mount Desert Island, the situation of this property is such as to protect you to the fullest extent from the nuisances which are so often found in summer resorts. The foresighted promise to prospective buyers was that, quote, when the property is cleaned up, the building sites should command fancy pricing. So the buyers sought were people of a certain economic and social stature. In order to assure that the clientele who would be the product and fruit of the Gilded Age, the Grindstone Point lots were, quote, not advertised for sale, only private sales made to the most desirable class of purchasers. Cottages shall not cost less than $2,000 in a time when a laboring man made $1 a day. Among the amenities were, for example, the company hotel, to be known as Grindstone Inn, to be more in the nature of a clubhouse than a summer hotel. It was to be built and available by the summer of 1891. And there's a picture, there are several pictures of Grindstone Inn over there. Summer owners were welcome to take their meals at the inn. Other amenities were a golf course and a tennis court and an anchorage for yachts, quote, the best on the coast, at the nearby Canoe Clubhouse. Offices of the company were in Winter Harbor and at number 7 Wall Street, New York. Clearly, there was a definition in mind of what they wanted this place to be. Clearly, village life, the village life in Winter Harbor and Prospect and Birch Harbor, other towns along the Maine coast. Clearly, village life was different to the way of life envisioned for the new resort. The two communities, Winter Harbor Village and Grindstone Point, Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, represented two different sides of social and economic divides. Shades of difference can be discerned in 3 houses of worship. In the community of Winter Harbor is the Baptist church used by the natives. On Grindstone Point is St. Margaret's Roman Catholic Church that was built for the Irish servants brought by their employers from Philadelphia. And at the top of the hill, St. Christopher's by the Sea Episcopal Church, where summer musicians and summer rusticators worship. Harbor Point separated the Sand Cove, where the yachts of Grindstone were anchored, from Winter Harbor itself, where the fishing and lobster boats were kept. Always division. Summer rusticators, as they were called, and their retinues, were transported from their urban homes to Gouldsboro by the Maine Central Railroad. The Land Improvement Company maintained its own steam launch called the Silver Star to make connections with trains and steamships to land its passengers in Gouldsboro at Winter Harbor. Baggage was checked through for the trip of not more than an hour from the train to Winter Harbor. The 1880 census in the town of Gouldsboro includes the port of Winter Harbor. It was on the verge of becoming a showplace of Vacationland in the Gilded Age. It was the value and income from the Grindstone properties that convinced the majority to divide the town. And in 1895, when Winter Harbor was separated from Gouldsboro, it was the value of and income from the Grindstone properties that convinced people that such a separation would be advantageous. Indeed, Vacationland made Gouldsboro so important that it ultimately allowed Gouldsboro and its neighbor Sullivan to separate into the two towns of Winter Harbor and Sorrento. The town of Winter Harbor, like the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, was conceived and hatched as Gouldsboro's baby. Parenthetically, voting members of my own family stood opposed to that division, which makes me very pleased to know. Not that it does me or anybody else any good. And so now I'd like to look a little bit at John Godfrey Moore. His picture is over there on the table. I did a paper a number of years ago for the Society on him, and he's a fascinating, fascinating man. Both Grindstone and Schoodic were given impetus for development by the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, but the development of either one was different to the other. Grindstone Point was a planned and developed community. One man very much involved in both was John Godfrey Moore, whose cottage, called Far from the Wolf, which is pictured over here a couple of times, still stands on the western shore of Grindstone Point, facing Bar Harbor across the bay. A native of Steuben, the son of a fisherman and captain, and descendant of generations of Down East people, he went to New York at an early age to work in lumber with his uncle. And as time passed through investment and an acute business sense, he became a representative of the Gilded Age and helped to bring its advent to Gouldsboro. He was the only Maine native in major leadership positions in the company, and mainly he who advanced much of the money for Grindstone Point development to get underway. His purpose was to make Grindstone Inn what he called a model of its kind, including bachelor quarters, many private baths, a glassed-in porch as a palm garden with open fires, billiard and pool rooms, and a barber shop. The motif was included in the hotel's dishes, and there's one plate over there. That's the pattern that was used for all the dishes in Grindstone Inn, and that plate was what my oatmeal was served on when I was a little boy, with butter and brown sugar on the top. Even its wallpaper was designed very carefully. So to those ends, in 1892, notice 3 years before the separation, he gave $10,000 to enlarge the inn in those ways. For much of his lifetime, John Godfrey Moore had admired Schoodic Point, which, quote, he used to contemplate from the doorstep of his father's house in Steuben as the ideals of the majesty of nature. And he says, quote, I bought these mountains and this land because I admired them as a boy. He acquired Schoodic gradually. He said, I have had 3 years of solid enjoyment buying up that land. It was mostly in small tracts belonging to the old families in this section. I'm a Yankee myself and was brought up among them, he says. In 1898, he paid personally to build roads on Schoodic, called Schoodic Drive, in a long system that, quote, gave employment to a large number of the people who needed money. At his early death in 1899, the Ellsworth American published a fascinating obituary, which said in part, quote, what interests the people in this vicinity in Mr. Moore is more than his successful business career. It is his loyalty to Maine, which has been the source of so much benefit in the vicinity of his summer home. And not alone because of benefits received, but because of the wholesome, lovable character of the man himself to his neighbors in Maine, and they feel deeply his loss. His funeral rites occurred at his parish church, at All Souls Episcopal Church in New York City, and at St. Christopher's on Grindstone Point, near his much-loved house, far from the wolf. He lived and prospered far away, but was always at home in Maine and contributed to its development and welfare. He is an important bridge figure in the movement of Maine from village to vacation land. And now finally, one other thing. This is a certificate. This is a real certificate of the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company, the people that bought stock in it. And one thing that fascinates me is this belonged Carter Berkeley Taylor, who had a house in Grindstone Point. And he was a lawyer in Philadelphia. My father and my uncle served as his caddies on the Grindstone Golf Course. And his grandfather was born in Hanover County, Virginia, which was my first parish and where I was ordained. And he was related to many of the people that I knew there. Remarkable. I got that on eBay, by the way. All right. Vacationland came to Maine after the Civil War as an outgrowth of the Gilded Age. In Gouldsboro, it became centered around the community of Winter Harbor. And remember, it was just like Prospect, Birch Harbor, or West Bay, any of those. Rusticators on Grindstone Point celebrated time away from their homes in New York and Philadelphia in Vacationland. For my family, the presence of those people in Grindstone Point, the rusticators, became a source of economic advantage and widened opportunity and a diversified economy. And there developed a relationship between natives and rusticators, which was a significant influence of my own family, who have lived in Gouldsboro since the saddle maker Jonathan Tracy, my ancestor, arrived in Gouldsboro at the very beginning, and David Joy, who arrived in the 1760s. Like the author Sarah Orne Jewett, whose voice we heard in the beginning of this paper, I myself am a bridge, a combination of native and, quote, from away. I was born in Bangor during World War II. I was conceived in South Carolina, and my mother insisted to my military father that she come home so that this baby can be born in Maine. My first home was in my grandparents' house in Winter Harbor on Sargent Street, with much time spent there with them ever afterwards. When I was 5 years old, we moved away to Connecticut, where with every summer in Vacationland in Maine, I went to school. I went to Virginia, where I still live after more than 60 years, where I attended college and married a Virginian who incidentally loves Maine at least as much as I do. At the Episcopal Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, I studied to become an Episcopal priest, and I was ordained priest in the Diocese of Virginia. I have served churches in a number of places in the state. My son was born in Richmond. Every summer has brought us home to Maine. I'm a Mainer born and a Mainer bred, and when I die, I'm a Mainer dead. So I grew up with Grindstone and Schoodic Point, the two focal points of the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company. I grew up with them as an integral part of my reality. Both were important for my family and for myself. My grandfather, also named Charles Joy, was a lobsterman in Winter Harbor, but also a yachtsman to several rusticators at Grindstone. My father and my uncle served as caddies on the Grindstone golf course. My grandmother often cooked special dishes, especially a special chocolate cake for Mrs. Eleanor Dixon. And I myself have clear memories from a very early age of going with my grandfather digging dandelion greens on the golf course in spring, being taken to the back shore at night to see what I called egg rock flashing red. And I remember the inn, though sadly emptied and out of business then, and the shock in my family of its burning in 1955. The relationship between natives and rusticators is often considered a case of finger pointing, but I find it best representative for me in a small family tale. My grandfather, Charles Joy, whose namesake I am, was hired when he was perhaps 9 years old to pump the organ on Sundays in St. Christopher's Church. His salary was 10 cents a week, at a time when many men earned $1 a day. He caught there in the church the attention of a man called Charles Thompson Cresswell, from Philadelphia, who was an important member of the group developing grindstone. He was a gifted artist. He asked my grandfather if he could hire him to cut the grass at his cottage for a salary of 25 cents per cut. It was a raise from pumping the organ. And then in 1905, when my grandfather was 11 years old, Mr. Cresswell asked him to sit for his portrait. His pay was 50 cents per sitting. His mother made him a new shirt of blue and white stripes and a light black jacket and a necktie. Charles Cresswell took the portrait that winter to Philadelphia, and it appeared in an exhibition of the Cresswell paintings. The next summer, 1906, he brought the portrait back to Maine, had it framed in Bangor, and gave it to my grandfather. It carries the original frame chosen by the artist for his own work. The portrait hung in my grandparents' home always. When my grandfather had died, Uncle Austin gave the portrait to me as my grandfather's namesake and oldest grandchild. One day, it will belong to my grandson, Charles Austin Joy III. And it is an icon of the symbiotic relationship that could and often did exist between natives and rusticators. And this is the portrait, which I will leave up here for you to see. This is the artist's signature in the upper right-hand corner of the portrait. And so I'll leave those here for you, if you want to have a look at those. Let's see. The work of the grindstone of the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company continues today in the two-pronged, very different forms of Grindstone Point and Schoodic Point. They are like two children of the same parentage, but who develop in very different ways. Both of them, Schoodic and Grindstone, are children of the Gilded Age in Gouldsboro, and both are Vacationland. Grindstone is the residential Vacationland community of the company, created by and for prosperous people from away. That vision is preserved largely still in its cottages, though the inn is absent. Schoodic, on the other hand, is part of the essential land and its beauty, which first drew the company to develop and grow. Today, it is an Acadia National Park, and it is a part of a vacation land for the whole country. Grindstone Point and its community, developed together, was nevertheless important for resident villagers in Winter Harbor, including my own family. The portrait and its history express the kind of connections that my family experienced in a broadening way. That was Grindstone, and now Schoodic. I grew up loving both aspects of the work of the company. Today, Grindstone is a place which I enjoy, which for me is not vacation land. My vacation land is Schoodic Point, which is for me the 21st century manifestation of the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company and its ongoing importance. Schoodic straddles Winter Harbor and Gouldsboro. My grandfather was born in 1894 at the entrance to Grindstone. My grandmother was born in 1896 at Birch Harbor, and both of them were born in the township of Gouldsboro. Today I enter Schoodic from Winter Harbor and departed at Birch Harbor in Gouldsboro. For me, Schoodic Point is the much-loved companion of my old age. At Schoodic, when I was very small, staying with my grandparents, every summer night after supper, we drove around Schoodic, always hoping for me to see a red fox. I loved the look and the sound and the smell of Schoodic Point. And I'm going to show you 3 paintings that hang in our house in Virginia. There are 3 artists, John Harris of Ellsworth, Clyde Aspervig of Montana, and this picture represents one of my pictures, and our son, Austin Joy. They are all of Schoodic Point. And finally, I present 2 small poems that I wrote at different times, which summarize my love of my native state, as represented by Schoodic Point. And so the first of these is called Schoodic Point, Maine. From infancy, I have been walking the granite headland. It stretches on step after step towards the place where in direct confrontation, land meets sea, where solid meets fluid, where now meets always. How many spruce, fir, and pine, living and dead, are passed on this journey? How many corners turned, where twists reveal fresh surprises, or vistas half seen in lateral vision? My companions, sweet fern and sea fog and heart-piercing sunshine, lave and massage the journey. The map is made moment by moment, whether warm and snug under snow or autumn leaves, or bright with spring or summer. Still pools by the roadside reflect the pilgrim moment, one after another, until insistent and compelling surf embraces land in every direction. This is a union guarded by island hills of light in Mount Desert and outrider sentinels in the far cranberries. Here, no matter whether I am present or away, is where complacency becomes ephemeral as seed pods blown before the wind. Here are the holy places of the heart, shrines to an insight bigger than our living, longer than any journey, deeper than bedrock beneath our feet. Here, for each moment, torment pauses and reposes in the quiet retreat of sound that finishes the breaking of a wave. And then the second one is called just at Schoodic. Heart beats in rhythm and thud, like heaviness of salt water breaking and reforming. Lungs fill and empty, in sighs like surf. Depression and dejection, sadness and sorrow begin to unravel and float jerkily away, like the spume evanescent as smoke, leaving trails of memory floating here and there around the ledges in the sea. And so these are the paintings that I'll leave here for you to see. This is the painting of the end of Schoodic Point by Jack Harris in Ellsworth. And this is the one that is referred to in this book here. That's also Schoodic Point. And this one is Blueberry Hill. It was painted by our son. And I have this hanging in our house in Virginia where I can sit in my reading chair and I can lift my eyes and look right along and see it. So those are there for you to see. Does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to mention, ask, say, tell, question?
I don't know if I caught it, but Moore, who was responsible for the main initial development of the area, how did he acquire his money to buy the
Because when he went to New York, he was working in lumber with his uncle. His uncle also, of course, came from Steuben. And he was evidently a financial genius. And after a while, he opened his own lumber business and wood products. And he evidently was just brilliant with money. And that's how he made the money himself. He didn't inherit the money like some people did. And so that's why you would say, well, he's part of the Gilded Age, because he didn't come from inherited money. I mean, his father was a fisherman in Steuben. So, and he made a huge amount of money. They had a son who was very young when he died. He had 2 daughters, and both the daughters ended up in England. And one of them was married to a member of the nobility. And their home was a place called Chequers, that you may have heard of in England, which is the country house of the prime minister. And they eventually, she and he, they had no children, they gave the house to the British government because they said everybody else in Parliament had a country house, but the prime minister had none, so they wanted the prime minister to have a country house. And the other sister was called Faith, and she was never married, but she lived in England near her sister. And she was the one who actually owned Scudic Point. And she was living in England. She wasn't interested. So she was the one who saw that it was turned over to be preserved by the park.
So, but he basically made his fortune with the lumbering business and connections that he made. That was lumbering done in Maine and then brought to New York, or?
Well, I mean, there was probably lumber from upstate New York and Pennsylvania and, all over the place, because it was in New York City.
So it wasn't a Maine connection there? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It might have been, for all I know, but I don't know that. I mean, it's possible, But by that time, lumbering in Maine had moved largely inland. It wasn't so much on the coast then, because, General Cobb talks about coming to Gouldsboro in 1795, and he said Gouldsboro Point, for example, was just as bare as the table, because it had all been lumbered. And everywhere there was cut over land, and, there were any number of sawmills in Gouldsboro. And anything else you have? Yeah.
So I just learned the other night that the stone at Grindstone actually would be useful for making grindstone. Was it called grindstone before the land improvements?
Oh, yes, it was, yeah. And Ephraim Wales Taft was the agent for John Black in Ellsworth at the Black House, and then beyond that for William Bingham and his estate. He was the land agent. And he talks in his journal in the 1830s about going to Grindstone Point because people were down there stealing lumber. He was always after somebody stealing lumber. And then this is called a shoe last, in case you didn't know it. Can everybody see this? My great-grandfather in Winter Harbor was born, of course, in Gouldsboro in 1870, and his father was a sea captain, and he was trained up to the sea, too. And so when he was 10 years old, his birthday was in December, so when he was 10 years old, it would be the summer of 1881. He was 10 years old, and he'd learned to row, and he was learning the ways of the sea, and he was learning the ways of village life. And he rowed out to Ironbound Island, and he found this shoe lass on the shore that had come from a shipwreck. And he brought it home, and he had a boathouse down on the shore. I used to love to get out of the boathouse with him. And so I was down there one day with him, and I said, "Big Grandpa, what's that shoe up there?" And so he took it down and showed me and told me what it was. He said, "Would you like to have this?" And I said, "Yes." And so I've loved it ever since. But this and these wooden things here, those wooden things and all that, they were all made in Gouldsboro. And the rings are rings that were used in the rigging of a vessel. And then that round thing that I used to use as a bowling ball when I was little, that is called a deadhead. And it's used also in the rigging. And it's made out of a wood called lignum vitae, which is the only wood that will not float. And so, but all of those, and all of those, and then this picture here in the front shows Winter Harbor with the workboats in it. And all of those represent the village and the village life. And contrast really with, kind of the elegance, Grindstone Point, Bar Harbor beyond it. But those were the native people, just like this. That's what that represents for me. Other questions you have?
That was Big Grampy. Was there a Little Grampy?
No, he was very tall. He was over 6 feet tall, and he had a great booming voice. And I was the oldest grandchild, so the oldest child sets the names, for the grandparents and all that. My grandchildren call me BB because my grandson started that, so that's what they all call me. But when he was little, he would come in. He had big feet, great big hands, and he would pick me up and put me on his lap, and he was so big. And so I would call him Big Gramp, because my father and my father's brother called him Gramp, so I called him Big Gramp. So that's where it came from, and yeah. So, yes, sir.
So what was the connection between Grindstone Point and Philadelphia? I would have thought with Boston being closer and the company being in New York that it would have been settled by folks from there. Why were people from Philadelphia?
I think originally it was because of the artists, and in Philadelphia they would see this spectacular place that the artists had painted. We got to go see that. Then, of course, they'd get here and they were hooked. But I think that's probably what the connection was. And, of course, the biggest amount of money was in Philadelphia and New York, really. Now, Sarah Orange Jewett, on the other hand, it was Boston for her, where she would go in the wintertime and then Maine in the summertime. But all those things about, in her books about leaving at the end of the summer and all that, that's exactly how I have always felt. At the end of the summer, it was time to go away. Yeah.
Why was Moore Cottage called Far from the Wolf?
The explanation that you most often say, did you all hear what she had? No. She wanted to know why Moore's Cottage was called Far from the Wolf. And I have a couple of pictures of it here. And I have a picture that was in a recent advertisement when it was for sale for over $1 million. It was, and so what the explanation now given is that the wolf represented Wall Street. And so the idea is that he could get away from Wall Street by coming here. So, wolf, I don't know what I'm saying here. That wolf was Wall Street, so when he was here, he was far from the wolf. But he grew up in a very ordinary fishing family. And I have an idea that it was called Far from the Wolf because he had come in his work in New York and his life in New York, have the wolf is far from the door. And so, which of course represents poverty, which he would have known all around him, he grew up in Steuben. And so I think that's where it came from. But it's a lovely house. And one of the pictures I have here is Mark Island Lighthouse in the same frame as Grindstone Inn. And I put it like that because it shows the unbelievable contrast between the village and the traditional people who lived here and then the Gouldsboro Land Improvement Company and the development that was made by them in very elaborate, elegant ways. But the Grindstone Inn, Moore gave $10,000 for a lot of improvements and so forth to it, which there again, in a time when a laboring man would make $1 a day, and if he had a son, the son working with him, it was $1.50 a day, and he gave $10,000 just for the hotel, never mind his own house and his residence in New York and all that.
There's time for one more question, maybe?
Right, yes.
What do you know about a ship running aground on the west coast over there in Grindstone that had a grindstone on board, and all they could salvage was the grindstone, and that's why it's called Grindstone?
Well, I don't know anything. I have no documentation. That's what everybody said, It could well be true. And if you look at that little plate in the food service from Grindstone Inn, there's a grindstone up at the top of it, which is kind of cute. But I don't know, never seen it documented.
Well, thanks again for a wonderful evening, Charles.